Good morning and welcome to the Platte Institute Virtual News Conference on today's release of the Platte Institute Policy Report, A Blueprint for Better Broadband in Nebraska. I'm Adam Weinberg here speaking, introducing everyone to today's program with Jim Smith, the Chief Strategy Officer here at the Platte Institute. Just kind of filibustering here for a brief moment as we get folks logged in for today's webinar and virtual news conference. I appreciate you all being here. Just the ground rules of today's program. We'd be happy, and Jim would be happy to take your questions, and you can chime in through the chat or Q&A sections throughout the program, and we'll make sure that we get to your questions. Jim is now going to introduce some of the outlines of the report, and then he'd be happy to open it up for any conversation that you have. Feel free to let me know if for any recording purposes you need to appear in today's program. I can bring you on to the panel to do that. Otherwise, of course, we're still going to have a recording available later today of today's program so that you can reuse any content that you need, and we'd be very happy to provide that in a forthcoming release. Now I'd like to pitch it over to Jim Smith, who's going to talk about today's report. Jim?
Thank you, Adam, for the introduction, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. For those of you that are familiar with Blueprint Nebraska, Blueprint Nebraska identified increased deployment of broadband as part of its 15-point plan for economic growth and competitiveness. Certainly, broadband is one of the key factors to statewide economic prosperity, and that's why it's on the minds of so many Nebraskans, and that is why we're having this presentation this morning. As Blueprint Nebraska's alliance partner, the Platte Institute has advanced the broadband discussion to the next level in its report, A Blueprint for Better Broadband in Nebraska. In my remarks today, I'm going to highlight the basic truths about broadband in Nebraska. I'm going to share the desired outcomes of this paper and then summarize the report's recommendations. So moving into the basic truths, and I say basic truths because these are some of the foundational elements as to how we arrive at our recommendations for addressing the broadband issue in Nebraska. So we know that without basic broadband access, all Nebraskans, including rural Nebraskans, are unable to enjoy the most basic elements of life. Those of us that live in the Omaha area, the Lincoln area, and populated areas around the state, we recognize and value broadband in our daily lives. And broadband access at higher speeds is absolutely essential, and it's an essential part of everyone's life in Nebraska. And it's important for economic competitiveness and growth, and that is one of the major reasons that Blueprint Nebraska identified it as one of 15 elements that needed to be addressed in order for us to be competitive with our peer states. Last mile rural broadband service is often overlooked while upgrading speeds in population centers. And what I mean by that is delivery to last mile customers that may be in rural areas of the state. They are often overlooked because our focus is primarily on the population centers across the state. The private sector has historically played a significant role in deploying broadband across the state. The position that we find ourselves today, the level of broadband connectivity that we have today, is because of investments by the private sector. So we do want to acknowledge and give recognition to the private sector's role in bringing us to the point we are today. The private sector and the state's public utilities or entities, like public power districts and municipalities, must cooperate if we are to meet the need of broadband across the state, particularly last mile broadband needs. So we recognize that there is a role for the public sector in these private-public partnerships. Collaboration between the executive branch, the legislature, and the Public Service Commission is absolutely essential. We cannot have silos if we are to effectively address the broadband needs in our state. And then there must be close coordination of federal funding if necessary to avoid waste. And I mentioned this later in this presentation, as well as in our report, that if all goes well and we receive all of the federal funding that has been targeted towards states for broadband deployment, and if we utilize all of the state funds that are available, we still only get halfway to the overall need of broadband deployment in our state. So we have to have close coordination of all funding, not just federal funding, but state funding as well, if we are really going to address all of the needs in Nebraska. So moving on from basic truths, I'd like to share with you what I see as the desired outcomes of this report. And the map that you see in front of you, the orange levels are areas where we have broadband deployment. The areas that are not orange on this map are those areas that are recognized as either being unserved or underserved, and that's defined in terms of broadband speed. You can see more about that in the report. So we want to start with improving the understanding of broadband and its importance to economic prosperity. Broadband, as I talk to many of the industry leaders, they recognize that broadband is such a complex, complicated issue, and it's not going to be explained in sound bites. It has to really be clearly understood in order for us to effectively address it through solutions. So this report is intended to create guardrails for considering those solutions and going back to recognizing the private sector's role and bringing the private sector along on this journey to improve our broadband standing. Another outcome is to clearly define the primary need in Nebraska, and that should be last mile deployment. When you look at our population centers, much of the issues around broadband in our population centers can be addressed through normal competition. However, when you get into rural Nebraska, for us to really address the last mile deployment, we really need to understand where those areas are in our state and what resources we have available to address them. We want to recognize the historic importance of private sector investment and why future engagement by the private sector remains critical to deployment success. So if I tell you that we estimate the total cost of deploying to every last mile customer and business across the state at somewhere in the neighborhood of $1.2 to $1.4 billion, yet with all the funding available to us over the next 5 years, maybe topping $500 to $600 million, you recognize that we only get halfway to the need, and we have to have this continued investment by the private sector to get us there. And then finally, to create a sense of urgency in developing efficient and effective uses of federal and state funding and safeguarding against waste. Duplication of efforts by entities is a form of waste, as well as not setting in place the right targets for deployment. So moving to the solutions that we have, I'd like to start with vision, action, and oversight. When we talk about designing an efficient and effective program for better broadband in Nebraska, we're talking about what that vision is, how to bring about targeted action, and then create the level of oversight to ensure that we avoid waste. So our first recommendation is to assign a high-level person in the administration, in the executive branch of Nebraska's government, to collaborate on design and deployment of a plan to coordinate all federal funds. And so some people may call this a broadband czar. The legislature has created a broadband coordinator position. I would say that that broadband coordinator position today is more of a mid-level position, possibly. We see the need to elevate that to a higher level of authority. And for that person to bring about and drive the vision and structuring the actions in order to fulfill the deployment needs in Nebraska. But we today have only one regulatory body in our state, and that's the Public Service Commission. And we absolutely must empower the Public Service Commission, recognize and equip them to manage the federal funding programs across local entities, also state policymakers and industry practitioners. And so what we envision is that this high-level broadband coordinator would collaborate with the Public Service Commission, not only in the vision for fulfilling broadband needs in our meeting the broadband needs in our state, but also making certain that they put in place an action plan and an oversight plan. Moving to the next group of recommendations around focusing on rural last mile customer users. I'd like to point out that broadband concerns typically can be overcome by competitive market models. We see that taking place in Omaha and Lincoln and many of the other populated communities across the state. But complications arise the less dense the population. And so we must prevent overbuilds that result in stranding last mile rural customers. That should be in the forefront of any recommendations and actions that we take. Also, I think a very good, strong approach would be the use of incumbent telephone company exchange boundaries in the application process. And you can learn more about that in the report. And then finally, encourage private sector investment. I myself I'm a product of public power, and I believe there is absolutely a role for public and government solutions to broadband deployment. However, we have to address that in such a way that we do not take away the incentives of the private sector to continue their investment in our state. And so that's where private-public partnerships come in to play. We recommend creating clear definitions of public and private roles in the deployment, operation, and ownership of networks so that we do not have the public sector overstepping the boundaries and taking away the incentives of the private sector. And then finally, to deploy the development of an option for access as a last resort. We recognize that there may be times in rural Nebraska that there is no private sector solution to the deployment. And so what does that exactly look like then for there to be full public access in those situations? And so we would recommend that there is a clear structure for how that would work. And so I'm going to conclude with the overview of the paper and invite there to be questions from anyone that's on the call with me today.
Thank you, Jim. And everyone, we're very happy to take your questions now on this report, which you can find a copy of in the release that I just sent you. And also it's online. Any of your audience members are welcome to read it as well. It's about a 15-minute read. You can find it at platteinstitute.org/policy. And if you'd like to chime in now at the Q&A section or in the chat window, Jim would be very happy to take as many questions as you'd like. Jim, while we're waiting for folks to type in some thoughts, do you have any, if there was one thing that someone who thinks they know the broadband landscape in Nebraska would look at this paper, something that they might find surprising, what would you say that would be?
I would say that, first of all, we can address the broadband issue in Nebraska without necessarily beginning to decide on one set of technologies or another. So if you look at the paper that the Platte Institute has published, we like to talk about being agnostic to the type of technology, but rather let's focus on the structure for that deployment for that last mile. And I think you'll find that quite interesting as you read through the report, that we really do not distinguish between coax technology and fiber technology, satellite technology, or fixed mobile technology, but rather the structure for making certain that the monies that are available to us go about our fixing our needs as quickly as we can. I do have a question here. Could you explain the last mile customer concept again? What is it and why is it bad? And I would not characterize it necessarily as being bad, but the last mile, typically middle mile, is the connectivity that takes place between commerce or institutions, larger users, larger communities. The last mile is really that stretch, if you would, to the home or to the business. So if you liken it to the electric utility grid, you have the generation, you have the transmission, and then you have the distribution of power to that home or to that business. That is the last mile, if you would.
Thank you, Jim. There's another question from Todd Van Kampen from North Platte Telegraph, and he is asking, have you studied how deployment of rural electrification played out in the mid-1900s, and what lessons does that offer you for building out broadband?
Well, that's very interesting, and I love to talk about public power. As I mentioned, I'm a product of public power. I spent half of my electric and gas utility career in investor-owned utilities as well as in public power, and they both have their pluses and their minuses. I would say that my experience in public power has been that it's not equipped as well as the private sector to manage risk. And with, for all those years that the electric grid was fairly stable and predictable, public power was able to be quite productive in the way it did its business. But as times have changed, and certainly on the generation side of that model, it became much more complicated. And I would say that public power probably was not as nimble to be able to navigate some of those changes in the power model over the last couple of decades. So it's because of that background, I think about that public power was brought about for a very specific reason, and that was rural electrification. That was really the origins of it. And the backbone of public power was always around creating reliability, accountability, and affordability. You can kind of overlay that onto the broadband model as well. But I would say let's fully utilize the private sector for this last mile deployment today, so that they can better manage the risk and not place that risk potentially placing that risk onto the taxpayer or the ratepayer in Nebraska. So public power, great model, but I do not believe today, in today's world, with the changing landscape for technology, that is the best equipped to address the broadband needs in Nebraska.
Jim, do you think Todd is just requesting a follow-up a bit more about the difficulties of getting service out to farms, ranches, and small towns in terms of the last mile concept? Maybe what could be learned from the last mile in terms of rural electrification and how it maybe crosses over to today's challenges with broadband?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where the private-public partnership comes into play. So we recognize that there are technicians across the state that are maintaining power lines, and there are technicians across the state that are managing cable or telephone lines. And so this is where utilizing technicians, utilizing services that are already in place and partnering with those existing services for the ongoing management in addition to the deployment of the lines. I think that's where the private-public partnerships have a significant role. Allow the private sector to manage the risk, engage with the public sectors that may already have technicians in the field to help manage the process of deployment and maintenance. And I think that serves everyone quite well. And those would be the types of models that we would encourage seeing developed.
Jim, Paul Hughes from WJAG in Norfolk has this question. Is there anyone from the private sector you've been in communications with yet?
Absolutely. Just due to my background in the legislature and working with telecommunications industry, at one time I did chair the Transportation Telecommunications Committee of the legislature. I have worked closely with members of the industry, both from various technologies in the industry. And I've also been in contact with people from the Public Service Commission to gain their insight and input. I am not going to suggest that this paper is endorsed by the industry or endorsed by the Public Service Commission, but I did work closely with stakeholders from those entities in developing this paper.
Thanks, Jim. William Padmore from Nebraska Public Media asks, would the governor have to appoint a broadband czar? What type of person would be good in that role? What resume would they have?
Well, I think if I had a magic wand to create the ideal person, it would be someone that would be steeped in understanding of our regulatory framework in Nebraska. So they would need to understand the Public Service Commission and its critical role in an ongoing regulatory position. I think it would need to be someone that is capable of breaking through barriers, bringing people together and building collaborative outcomes on options for solving the broadband issue. And also someone that is also very good in managing finances, being able to understand where these dollars are coming from and how best to report and make certain that it's transparent how these dollars are being used. So someone with those types of skill sets and background, they don't come along every day. I do not believe that it would be prudent to go outside the state of Nebraska. I think someone from Nebraska that understands Nebraska would be critical. Yes, I think that it would be the governor that would have to create that type of role. It just to be clear, the broadband coordinator position has been created by the legislature already. There is funding available for that position, and I believe that it resides in the CIO's office underneath the governor's cabinet member. What we're recommending is to elevate that to a higher level in order to that person might have the gravitas to be able to break through some of the barriers that I'm afraid that the current person may have.
Thank you, Jim. And thank you everyone for your questions so far. It looks like we may be winding down, but if you do have a question, you can ask in the chat. Oh, I just saw one come in. Senator Deb Fischer has been an advocate for increased broadband access for a long time. Have you been in communication with her?
I have not. I enjoyed serving with Senator Fischer when she was in the legislature. She preceded me as chairing the Transportation Telecommunications Committee. And I feel that I know Senator Fischer well, and I appreciate her advocacy. And I believe that what you're seeing in our report lines up very, very well with what her ambitions are for better deployment of broadband in Nebraska.
Just as we close this out, Jim, do you have any thoughts about, given the fact that we're still going to be probably half of the funding short of what it would take to really connect every home or business in the state, what is the best way to prioritize serving unserved and underserved communities with broadband?
Well, I think one of the ways in which it's been prioritized in the past is based on population. So you want to cover as much population as possible and then work your way down to that singular last mile customer uh, uh, on the far outskirts of town all by themselves. That's one approach to doing it. I think also we cannot miss the opportunity for taking into consideration opportunities for economic development. So if it's a matter of needing broadband into certain areas to encourage a development, a known development to occur that would bring jobs and opportunities to a community, I think that needs to be recognized as well. I'm not going to suggest that I have all the right answers to the best ways to prioritize, but I think it goes back to getting the right folks in place to build that vision, the action plan, and the way to provide the oversight. So I would put that level of detail into the hands of the individuals that we're recommending to be put into place.
Well, thank you, Jim. And folks, this is content from our new report that you can find at platteinstitute.org/policy, a blueprint for better broadband in Nebraska. And you should also have a copy in your most recent news release. There will be a copy of this recording on your way coming soon in a forthcoming release. And we'd welcome any additional questions that you might have on this release and other Platte Institute releases, which should be coming throughout the year in the legislative session ahead. Thank you for spending this time with us, and we'll look forward to talking again soon.